This is an essay in the series After the Walls Come Down, Building New Institutions from the Remains of a Broken World by William Young.
In May 1776, John Adams wrote a letter to James Sullivan which said, quote, "Depend upon it, sir, it is dangerous to open so fruitful a source of controversy and altercation as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. There will be no end of it. New claims will arise. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to. And every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state. It tends to confound and destroy all distinctions and prostrate all ranks to one common level." Unquote. Of the non-voting groups Adams mentions, women could vote after the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1920. Women had played an important role in the nation's war efforts during World War I. Every man who has not a farthing is now allowed to vote, unless the powers that be find reasons for excluding him other than his bank balance. Of the lads from 12 to 21, the group between 18 and 21 could vote after the 26th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1971. War played a role in that amendment because young men deemed old enough to be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War were not able to express their views about the war through the ballot box. The only people on the Adams list not now able to vote are those 12 to 17 years old. The idea of lowering the voting age to 12 is not often discussed. Phyllis Kahn, who served in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1973 to 2016, spent many years advocating for the voting age to be lowered to 12, but her efforts did not gain traction. A reason she chose age 12 is that Minnesota's government documents were written for people with a 7th grade reading level. Kahn thought people who can understand government documents should be able to vote. About a dozen U.S. local jurisdictions have lowered the voting age to 16. In some places, 17-year-olds can vote in primaries for federal elections if they turn 18 before the general election. Outside the U.S., numerous countries have already lowered their voting age to 16 or 17. In the book Escape from Childhood, The Needs and Rights of Children, John Holt advocated the right to vote for people of any age. To determine which citizens should be allowed to vote, one must address the issue of who is a citizen. Some people use the Patrick Henry standard, saying that nobody should be subject to taxation without representation and all taxpayers should be allowed to vote. By this criterion, a 5-year-old should be allowed to vote after paying sales tax for a candy bar. Another approach would be to make the right to vote part of the rite of passage into adulthood. Both history and biology suggest that people around the age of 12 are adults. John Adams probably chose to talk about lads from 12 to 21 rather than children for a reason. The groups he singled out were adult members of society whom he considered to be at a lower social or intellectual level. In 1776, people 12 to 21 were well integrated into the economic and social life of their communities, as they were through the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of junior high school barely existed, and only about 5% of adolescents attended high school. The rest were not lounging around watching television and playing video games. They had adult responsibilities. Most were working in family businesses or farms, working in a factory or other type of job, or learning a trade through an apprenticeship. And most worked very hard. The Scotsman Robert Owen was considered a utopian reformer in the 19th century when he sought to shorten the workday to 10 hours and raise the minimum age of workers to 10. The concept of adolescence is fairly recent. The current practice of segregating teens in educational institutions and not allowing them to constructively participate in society is extremely aberrant in the context of most of human history. In paintings from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you will not see youngsters who look like adolescents because people in this age group were considered adults. The same attitude existed when John Adams lived. Today, many cultures in the world continue to initiate people into adulthood somewhere around puberty. Western industrial societies have created an artificial category for people now deemed to be between childhood and adulthood. With regard to allowing them to vote, the important question is whether adolescents should be considered more like children or more like adults. I have asked many of my friends how they would feel about lowering the voting age to 12. Most initially smiled or laughed, thinking I must be joking. They did not think anyone could seriously suggest that irresponsible, ignorant, pimply little creatures could be entrusted with the serious business of deciding who should run the country. Before the 19th Amendment was ratified, similar ridicule came from men who believed that irresponsible, ignorant, menstruating women should not worry their pretty little heads with important political decisions. Upon realizing I was serious, some of my friends became defensive, suggesting that teens are too ignorant and inexperienced to vote. Such a response is based on two assumptions. One, there is a threshold of knowledge and experience for casting a vote, and two, people who lack such knowledge or experience should not be allowed to vote. If one could devise a test to determine suitability for voting, it could not be administered without changing federal law. In 1975, Congress banned literacy tests, and it probably would not want to reopen such an unpleasant episode of American history. Congress would also have to confront the question of whether people who are 18 and older would have to pass the test. Requiring each prospective voter to take a competence test probably would result in many teens passing, a greater number failing, and an extremely large number of people 18 and older failing. Some people argue that teens are not qualified to vote because they are cognitively different than older people and do not yet have the ability to reason analytically. Various theories about cognitive development are based on the idea that adolescence is a time of significant development that determines how a brain will function for the remainder of a person's life. The types of activities in which teens engage affect how their brains will change. If such theories are correct, the encouragement of teens to become involved in political and citizenship activities could promote a continuation of such activities in the future. Every age group contains people with a range of understanding, experience, and intelligence. There are broad differences in cognitive and analytical skills among people who now are allowed to vote. If society could determine the qualities necessary to vote competently, people do not magically develop them upon turning 18, just as before 1971, people did not magically develop them upon turning 21. I have met teens who are better informed about social and political issues than some of my 18-plus-year-old acquaintances. I know others who are fixated on sports, music, and/or sex, and seem as ill-prepared to make political decisions as older people with the same fixations. Civil rights and voting rights struggles in American history have involved subordinate groups trying to counter stereotypes promulgated by dominant groups. In 1900, most men believed that all women were unqualified to vote, and most Southern white men believed all Negroes were unqualified. Such stereotyping favors the least able members of the dominant group over the most able members of the subordinate group. These restrictions have more to do with deep-seated prejudices and the desire to protect societal advantages rather than voting competence. Simply because 21st century American teens have access to political information does not mean they will understand it. But nothing in the Constitution says that people who now are eligible to vote need to understand issues before voting. Nobody imposed such constraints on the Adams voters or imposes them now on voting-aged Americans. How teens are likely to vote is irrelevant to the issue of whether they should be allowed to vote. People should not be granted the franchise based on how they are likely to vote any more than people should be granted freedom of speech based on what they are likely to say. The overriding consideration is whether they should be treated as citizens. When women campaigned for the franchise at the beginning of the 20th century, opponents made dire predictions about the effects of women voters on the political system. After the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, the first three presidents elected were Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, all conservatives. All three probably would have been elected had women not voted. The turnout by women shortly after gaining suffrage was fairly low, just as the turnout by the 18 to 20 age group has been low since the passage of the 26th Amendment. For these groups, earning the right to vote turned out to be more important than actually voting. In many ways, the 12 to 17 age group experiences less upheaval than the 18 to 20 age group. People in the latter group often are finishing high school and starting a full-time job or college. In many cases, they will leave home for the first time. Some people get married and might start a family. Those entering college might go to a different locality where they are not familiar with the local or state politics. With all of these major life changes, registering and voting might not be a high priority. By contrast, most people in the 12 to 17 age group do not have to deal with these upheavals. Whatever schools are teaching now about the importance of participating in the democratic process clearly is not resulting in higher voter participation rates. If students could supplement learning about government in curricula, which still include such subjects, with assignments to learn about the candidates, ballot initiatives, and bond issues in an upcoming election, they might develop a better understanding about why voting is important. The lessons could be reinforced if students were subsequently taken to polling places on election day and allowed to vote. Such experiences might inspire young people to continue to vote after they turn 18. If teens become active in the political process and start talking about candidates and issues at the dinner table, in households that still sit together at a dinner table, apathetic parents might be induced to vote as well. Some argue that the votes of young people could be bought easily by unscrupulous politicians. Adams and other founding fathers use a similar argument for denying votes to poor people. Undoubtedly, some vote buying would occur with teens, mostly with baseball caps, t-shirts, and assorted junk made in China. However, candidates would have to be wary about engaging in such practices. Because of the protective attitude parents have toward their children, politicians trying to buy votes from young people might alienate older voters. Also, many teens might be highly suspicious of candidates using such ploys. In some ways, buying off young people might be more difficult than slipping money, liquor, or other gifts to older voters. Lowering the voting age by 6 years would increase the voting age population by a bit more than 25 million, or about 10%, spread evenly around the country. People 12 to 17 never would comprise anything close to a majority in any major jurisdiction. Politicians could not gerrymander districts based on the number of teen voters. Some states or localities might have a slightly higher or lower percentage of teens depending on population trends in the area. The percentage in any given year might depend on whether the teens were part of a baby boom or baby bust cycle. Older Americans are unlikely to initiate a campaign to lower the voting age. The initiative would have to come from teens. Young people have one big advantage over most other groups who have sought the franchise. Women who gathered at the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 did not know if they would be able to vote in their lifetimes. Suffrage for most women did not occur until 72 years later in 1920. African Americans after the Civil War did not know whether their voting rights would be guaranteed. Not until 100 years later, when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, did America make a commitment to African American voting rights. People currently in the 12 to 17 age group know they soon will be old enough to vote. They will reach 18 when many current state and national legislators are still in office and will seek re-election. Young people lobbying for a lower voting age thus would have considerable leverage. When seeking a legislator's support, teens could say they will remember whatever position the legislator takes on teen suffrage. Were the issue to achieve national attention, it might gain a surprising degree of political momentum. The major political parties might examine the issue to determine possible advantages in future elections. During the first half of the 19th century, some states had different voting rules depending on whether the elections were for state or federal offices. Certain groups were allowed to vote in state elections, but not federal elections. The opposite situation arose before the 26th Amendment was ratified in 1971. In 1970, Congress had passed an addition to the 1965 Voting Rights Act to allow 18-year-olds to vote, but the Supreme Court ruled that the law applied only to federal elections, not state and local elections. The prospect of providing separate ballots and voting machines for 18 to 20-year-olds created such serious logistical concerns that Congress quickly passed a constitutional amendment that applied to all elections, and the states quickly ratified it. Based on these experiences, changing the law to lower the voting age throughout the country would require the much more difficult process of passing a constitutional amendment. Teens could start their campaign by working to lower the voting age in individual states rather than the entire country. The federal government can prohibit certain types of restrictive voting procedures by states, but states and localities are entitled to create voting criteria that are more liberal. Before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, women were allowed to vote in Wyoming and some other western states and territories. Men who moved west to seek land, gold, or other resources wanted female companionship, and women's suffrage laws were used as an inducement to attract women settlers. While women were campaigning for the 19th Amendment, one of their arguments to counter the dire predictions by opponents was that Wyoming allowed women to vote and no political chaos ensued. Even if the voting age is lowered, MAGA parents will continue to raise MAGA children. Many teens still will be brainwashed in the equivalent of MAGA madrasas as local school boards revise curricula to present the world from a MAGA perspective. And many more teens will be sucked down rabbit holes by fascists who are flooding social media with pernicious messages. Still, a few issues have caused a lot of teens to become politically involved in important causes. One is gun violence, which has had a severe impact on many schools around the country. Hundreds of school shooting incidents occur in the U.S. each year. Many students have been traumatized by the shootings, especially those who have seen some of their classmates shot or have been shot themselves. The government response to the carnage has been to make students in many schools enter through metal detectors and in some cases to arm teachers and school security guards. Some students have organized school walkouts and other forms of protest to call attention to the problem. They are more sensible than the legislators who rake in contributions from the gun lobby and block any meaningful response to the proliferation of guns. Another issue is the governance of schools. Most teens are forced to attend school but cannot participate in decisions about their schooling. They should be allowed to vote in school board elections so they will have some say in policies that directly affect them. Many teens are likely to know what reforms might be needed in their schools. Current voters with no school-age children might not know or care about such issues. Rather than thinking of other schools in their district as sports rivals, teens would have an incentive to reach out to students in these schools to organize joint political action and possibly to swing elections of school board members. In the Louis Malle movie My Dinner with Andre, which features a long conversation over dinner between Andre Gregory and Wallace Shawn, Gregory says, quote, "See, I think it's quite possible that the 1960s represented the last burst of the human being before he was extinguished, and that this is the beginning of the rest of the future, and that from now on there will simply be all these robots walking around and feeling nothing, thinking nothing, and there will be nobody left to remind them that there once was a species called the human being with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet." Unquote. Much of that last burst of the human being that Gregory talks about came from baby boom children who were concerned about the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and many other social issues. The period featured a lot of turbulence, with many young people envisioning a better way to live. The vision did not last. These baby boom children are now at retirement age, and while some have retained their spirit from the 1960s, a distressing number now support a seriously unsustainable way of living. Mass movements to improve the status of women, African Americans, gays, and some other groups are offshoots of the spirit of the 1960s, but no figure as well known as Martin Luther King has emerged in any of these movements. Ask people to name a current leader of the women's movement, the gay rights movement, or the African American movement, and they might have trouble thinking of one. One movement is a notable exception. Ask people to name a leading figure in the youth climate movement, and most know about Greta Thunberg. She is not an American, but climate breakdown is not a crisis only in America. In 2018, Thunberg started her climate protests at age 15 by skipping school on Fridays and sitting alone outside the Swedish parliament with a sign reading "Skolstreik för klimatet," which means school strike for climate. Her simple act of protest grew into a worldwide movement. The impetus for the youth climate movement is the existential threat which climate breakdown poses. Rather than being a threat to individuals, as the Vietnam War was for draft-eligible young men, climate breakdown broadly threatens the welfare of life on the planet, including humans of all ages. Young people are likely to suffer greatly, and the older people who have caused the crisis will be dead by the time some of the worst effects arise. The youth climate movement has been among the most vociferous groups in demanding the end of fossil fuel use and calling for significant actions to address climate breakdown. I trust them more to make intelligent decisions than the people who now are voting for fascism and totalitarianism in the United States and many other countries. Teens will not be able to prevent climate breakdown by voting, but they could possibly form a core of citizen activists that will grow over time into a movement to address climate problems that most current voters are ignoring. The upside for teen voting far exceeds the downside. Considering what is happening now and is likely to happen in the future with climate breakdown, gun violence, and other important issues, teens deserve a voice in determining who will make decisions about policies that will greatly affect their lives.